Great. So welcome everyone to today's conversation where LGBT Great is delighted to be talking about the power of now, which is the National Inclusion Week 2022 theme. You have the whole team today with you from LGBT Great side. And the aim of today is to really have a conversation with you amongst ourselves and to share with you a few of the insights and thoughts that we've had around National Inclusion Week. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping points. The session today is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel afterwards. So if there are colleagues who are unable to attend, you can don't fear that they will be able to view the recording afterwards. We will also be taking some questions today. There are a few ways you can submit questions, either through the Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of your screens. Please feel free to submit these anonymously or with your name. We don't mind either way. Or if you would like to post a question on the chat function so everyone else can see it, you're welcome to do that too. In terms of the chat, we also welcome any thoughts or reflections or comments as we go on the content or conversation. I know that there will be a couple of polls today to keep you on your toes, so look forward to those in due course. But I suppose that's it from me in terms of housekeeping. Matt, is there anything you'd like to say as we embark on this conversation today?
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and a warm welcome to everyone that's sort of dialing in, whether it's morning or afternoon, your time, a very warm welcome. And yeah, really delighted to be bringing you this conversation as part of National Inclusion Week. So this is a really big week in the diversity and inclusion calendar, and focuses on all different dimensions of diversity and inclusion. I want to say special thank you as well to all of the team that have really put a lot of work in today to making what is going to be this session really interesting, really informative, and also for your hard work as well in driving engagement across our membership community. Now, really exciting times at LGBT Great. We have seen a continued growth of our membership community across 2022, which really says to me how important LGBT plus DE&I is now across the industry, but in business more generally. And with almost 21% now of Generation Z, that's 16 to 24-year-olds, identifying as LGBT plus or future talent, it's critically important that we as organisations and as businesses can really ensure that we can make LGBT people feel really included and welcome. And there's definitely a strong intent from across the industry to achieve this. I guess that the first big point I'd like to make today is that, generally speaking, businesses love data. We're absolutely infatuated with numbers. We make decisions based on that data. And because of that, when we think about diversity and inclusion, for me, diversity means the numbers, the representation. How many people do we have from each community? Whereas inclusion, for me, I think of inclusion as feelings. How do we feel? And tied into sort of the feelings part intrinsically is this point around culture, belonging, engagement, inclusive environment, and actually broader picture, how we create what we call an ecosystem of inclusion within our organisations. Now, it's a fact that financial services in particular have really focused on the diversity, particularly over the last 20 years. But I would sort of put it to you all today that just by focusing on the numbers doesn't necessarily mean that we improve the numbers. So if we take a quick example of the number of female fund managers in the UK today, it was sort of given to be below the number that we had 20 years ago. And that's despite a 20-year focus on trying to improve the numbers. So what it tells me is that we really do need to lift the bonnet up within all of our organisations to understand what are the barriers that are preventing from underrepresented talent from becoming a greater proportion and density of our workforce population, and what's stopping them from achieving their full potential and staying within the industry. And secondly, I'm a big believer, and for those of you who know me, I know there's a lot of new people on the line today, so welcome to new members, welcome to potential members, and welcome to all of our existing membership community. But I do believe that actions speak far louder than words. And it's a fact from all of my experience of talking to organisations about DE&I. This is a topic that gets a lot of attention, lots of conversations, lots of very positive intent. But actually what we rarely see is a lot of that goodwill, that passion transpiring through to action, the power of now, which can really make a difference. So I do believe we have to approach DE&I as a strategic dynamic, one that is smart, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. And I think if we can do that, we've got a really good opportunity to move forward. So the time absolutely is now. Now, the third point that I'd like to make is that what we often see as a perceived barrier to more D&I happening is that the focus around people's time, resources, and tools. But I would absolutely say that if we can see kind of where we want to be, if we can understand where we are at the moment, and if we can also figure out what we need to do next, we've got a much sort of clearer way of helping colleagues and different businesses to understand what it is that they can do right here, right now, in the moment. So having a framework which is clear and pragmatic, and that enables us to capitalize on the power of the tiny game, something I talk about a lot. I believe with a real sort of targeted focus, there's a fantastic opportunity to really level up for LGBT people across the industry. Now, Alex mentioned a second ago, we do sort of keep you on your toes today. So I'd like to invite you all actually just to do a quick bit of thinking with me. And what you're going to see in front of you in a second is a quick poll question. So Lauren, if you could just launch the first poll and let's see what folks are sort of saying today. So the question is, what would you like to hear about today's presentation? So we've got an option here. What is National Inclusion Week? What does inclusion mean? Understanding what authentic allyship means in practice, better understanding my organisation, learning more about LGBT Great. So pop your questions through there. So we've got a number of people that are now voting. So you should see this on the question in front of you. Okay, we've got a flurry of votes coming through. So what would you like to hear about today's presentation? So National Inclusion Week, what does inclusion mean? Authentic allyship, how you can track as an organisation. A bit more about LGBT Great. So there's a few final votes coming through. We've got 83% of you that have now voted, 86%. I'm just going to give it another few seconds, Alex, before I hand over to you to talk through the results and move today's conversation on.
Perfect.
Super. And if we could close the poll, Lauren, and then show Alex and the viewers the results. And Alex, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And as again, from my side, welcome to everyone joining today. Yeah, interesting results from the poll. It seems that there's something that comes immediately out, which is understand how my organization can track and monitor. We will be talking a lot about that later in terms of how LGBT Great can support you, but also how you can monitor and track some of this inclusion work as well as diversity. Often they're interlinked, but this is definitely something we'll cover. Second is then authentic allyship. So we'll be talking a little bit later about the difference between authentic and performative allyship. So I think that will be interesting to everyone on the call here. And then National Inclusion Week will also cover off those in more detail as well. So yeah, no, good. Thank you. That gives us a bit of a steer today as we continue the conversation. I just want to share with you broadly what the agenda is today. We've had our introduction, so then we'll talk a little bit about global LGBT plus trends and a short update from Shreyas and I on what the news stories that we're thinking about at the moment. Then we'll move on to just briefly covering what National Inclusion Week is, some of the goals, objectives, and then reflect with you on this theme for this year, which is the power of now. And broadly speaking, I think we'll cover off why positive action now will have a beneficial effect in the future. Finally, there's an opportunity to reflect as a group on the key takeaways and next steps, as well as a few suggestions from us on how you today can affect positive change in your organization through allyship, through positive, authentic allyship moving forward. For those that have joined these types of sessions before, you'll see a couple of slides that I always tend to trot out just to cover off what it is that LGBT Great does for those that may be new to us as an organization. So we are a membership firm for financial services, and we intend to empower organizations and individuals to improve their LGBT plus DE&I through a myriad of different ways. Our goal is really to drive positive change. At the moment, we currently represent over 600,000 employees globally. We have a long-term strategic goal to spotlight 1,000 LGBT role models and allies, and I don't know what the latest figures are. I think we're well into the 600s now, which is very exciting. So, one of the things we'll be asking today is if there are people in your organization, in your teams, that are doing great things to empower others around DE&I, not just LGBT DE&I, but generally, then we'd love to hear about them and get them spotlit as well as part of the ongoing work we're doing in sharing those initiatives, sharing those individuals and the work that they're doing. Okay, so that's just a little bit about us. In terms of what we do, for those that are not sure, we have a range of ways that we can support organizations, a range of products, a range of services to feel empowered. My role as Global Insights and Content Manager sits within this red section here around data-driven insights, where we look at benchmarking, industry research and training. And then visibility and outreach, and Hector on our team here, who's our new marketing and brand manager, leads on much of the social media and employer branding. And then Lauren, who is our member operations lead and project manager, is the central contact point for mentoring and the role modeling programs. And then, of course, we have Matt, who is our glorious leader, and who you can get in touch with if you would like to hear more about membership options with LGBT Great. So yeah, we seek to really empower organizations through a range of things. So if anything on there looks like something you would like to get in touch and talk to us about in more detail, and you're not already, then please do feel free to drop a note to anyone on the call today. Our emails are just first name at lgbtgreat.com. That's the housekeeping over. Just to give you a sense of who our clients and community members are, we have nearly 50. We're on touching distance of 50 members now, brought on a range of members recently, including Nikko Asset Management, our first Japanese asset management member, which was exciting. So we really have a global perspective on DE&I, on LGBT DE&I around the world. And this global perspective is very important for us because, being based in London and often having conversations with banking or financial services institutions that have a strong presence in key financial centers like London and New York, we do have a tendency, I think, as an industry to sometimes be a bit Eurocentric, be a bit Anglocentric. And so one of the pushes from our side has really been to expand that perspective and to bring those insights and that information on a global scale to our members. And with that in mind, we thought it might be useful to just share with you 5 or 6 of the kind of key global insights that we're seeing at the moment, particularly around some of the most recent news stories that we're seeing. And Shreyas, who's on the line, is one of our brilliant interns, and I have been working on pulling these all together recently. And so, Shreyas, it'd be great just to hear a little bit from you, if that's okay, on the key trends that you're seeing on from a global perspective when it comes to LGBT plus inclusion and LGBT people challenges, issues, kind of more generally, if that's okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Alex, for that beautiful introduction. Yes, we've been working on the digest, and I mean, it's always interesting to be updated about the LGBT plus news around the world. And I think the key trends can be bucketed into 3 main, basically main, I'd say like basic themes. And like the first one would be trans and non-binary inclusion, and unfortunately sometimes exclusion. So whenever I open the news, there's always this topic in the headlines, and it's always interesting to read about. Sometimes I am a bit apprehensive, but sometimes I'm also a bit positive about it, because then, for example, building on some examples here, thinking about the US, there's so many anti-trans bills that are trying to be passed currently, and then like recently in Virginia, the governor of the state has actually repealed the laws that actually protect trans students in schools, which I think is very dangerous. And of course, when I read this, I'm not I am disheartened, but then there's positivity too on this bucket, I'd say. And the positivity comes from, for example, Malta, thinking about how the Prime Minister Robert Abela has now like passed a law which makes sure that gender affirming surgery is state sponsored. I think that is a very big and progressive stride in trans inclusion and non-binary inclusion. And like, for example, thinking about my own home country, India has open trans clinics, which is, I think, amazing. So I think there's like two sides of the coin, and it's always interesting to read about trans and non-binary inclusion, but this is always like a trend that's persistent. And then thinking about another trend, I think there's always an anti-trans sentiment through different regions of the world. And I mean, of course, again, a disheartening one, but I think it needs to be acknowledged. And while working on it, we were recently covering like the 2 gay women who were sentenced to death in Iran, which was, again, a bit of gloom and doom, I'd say, but it is important to know. And then again, we need to think about, for example, Turkey having these anti-LGBT plus protests, and that is interesting. They're against people who are LGBT plus people in news and media, stuff like that. And of course, this is a persistent trend yet again. We always see this in the news cycle. And then I think the most positive and beautiful one is the third bucket that I've self-made, but the bucket of like repeals of laws and legalization of same-sex marriages, homosexuality. So, for example, thinking about Singapore right now repealing the colonial 377A law, which is, I think, a huge stride in the progress that we're making as a community in the world. And especially just, I think, a couple of days ago in Cuba, we saw the legalization of same-sex marriage, more rights given for gay parents to adopt. I think like we are making very progressive strides, but I think holistically we have to look at everything and acknowledge the bad and the good, because I think that gives us a perspective of where we have come and where we need to go. But yes, that is my thoughts on it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I completely agree and echo. I think it's very interesting in conducting the work that we do here around collation of insights and stories, which I can see in the chat. Lauren has shared a copy of our last 2 digests, the next one of which is due to go out tomorrow. So if you're not already signed up to our platform to receive those, then we can share the link to enable you to do that. But I agree, it's very interesting to see the range of positive and negative stories. And I think this is reflective of LGBT inclusion in an organizational context as well, where you see in certain regions, in certain industries, in certain types of organizations, very positive strides being made. And then the flip side of, somewhere like the US, for example, where there are a range of bills and national legislation, etc., that is removing and eroding some of those rights and protections. And I think for me is certainly makes me think of the power and importance that organizations play here in providing those safe spaces for LGBT folks at work, and how powerful ensuring that it can be to ensure that those spaces are, visible, that they are well communicated and inclusive. And I suppose really goes back to what we're talking about today, which is this idea of inclusion. Andreas, it'd be interesting to hear, I know you and I have talked a lot about India and the UK, and obviously coming on as an intern, you've had a different perspective of LGBT Great. Be interested just to hear a little bit about your reflections on this idea of inclusion at work. If you could just share a few thoughts about, the good and bad that you've seen already, that would be, I think, really interesting for everyone.
Yes, absolutely, Alex. I think that's we have had so many conversations about this, and I'm always very passionate about discussing the differences, the contrasts that I have personally seen. So I believe that inclusion comes from safety, acknowledgement of identity, and, validity of your identity. I think that's where inclusion is driven from. And when I was working in India and different kinds of organizations, of course, on paper, there's a lot of legalities, there's a lot of pro-LGBT plus laws that have come into place, which is good. But the stigma still remains, and I could always feel that when I used to work there. I mean, I could not bring my true self to work, if that makes sense. I felt, I would come to work, but I would want to hide some part of myself. And I think that is something that was obviously affecting my morale and how I used to work. So also, I think in India, there's I actually could feel the difference when there were no vocal allies around me, because no one actually, I mean, of course, if you're part of the community, you're advocating for the community, but if you're outside, they would not advocate for you, which also used to affect how I worked there, because it used to drive my productivity down, I'd say. But now that I'm here, and I like at LGBT Great, everyone is so sweet. When I come, everyone's genuine, everyone's authentic. I think that's a very like big morale booster. I feel more at home. I feel more like I belong. I think that's very important. And of course, there's vocal allyship all around, which is also beautiful. And I completely believe that having a safe space, having a space where you can actually be yourself authentically does drive productivity, does drive morale, does drive efficiency, and has personally done it for me. So I think I'm very grateful to be working here, and I can see the contrast very well.
I promise we've not paid him to say that. No, I think that's beautiful. Thank you, Shreyas, for those words. And you and I have spoken a lot about the differences in organizational approaches to inclusion. And you raise a really interesting point actually around the correlation between inclusion and productivity, which I think is very interesting. I'm sure people on the call have experienced moments of additional emotional toil at work, unnecessary. Where you spend too much time investing your energy in navigating a non-inclusive or uninclusive environment, and the impact that has on your actual work. And I think that's a point that I hadn't really thought about before. Is this, the more inclusive an environment is, the easier it is to then invest your time in work and not in unnecessary emotional work. So yeah, very interesting perspective. I think I'd be interested to hear anyone on the call your thoughts and reflections on the inclusion that you've seen or not seen in your own environments, and potentially the relationship that has with productivity. Matt, I don't want to put you on the spot, but is there anything you wanted to add here around your experience of inclusive and non-inclusive environments?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the point that Shiraz raised around not feeling 100% confident within your environment. We know that emotion is often felt by underrepresented communities, and I've been there as well, when you feel like you're the only one, and you get kind of guarding yourself, right, and holding something back continuously, and it's a bit like having a cloud of smoke just over you the whole time. So I do resonate with that. And actually, from a number of the conversations that I and we at LGBT Great have, of course, we have lots of LGBT plus folks across financial services that are regularly getting in touch with us. I'd say that point around psychological safety and the lack of safe spaces are quite often the key things that we tend to see out of those conversations. Now, of course, there is some positivity as well, in that we hear folks say, well, actually, I feel really safe in my environment. There's lots of visibility, there's lots of support from executive leadership, these sorts of things. But I think, absolutely imperative that everybody can feel amazing, within the workplace. As far as work goes, of course, no job always feels amazing, of course. But I think, that creating that level of confidence is absolutely fundamental. And sort of tying this back to the theme of today, the power of now, I genuinely want everyone to be as great as they can be, pardon the pun, within their role, within their industry, right? And I think that's what we're trying to achieve through a lot of the LGBT Great program. I would pick up on, there's been a few points come through just privately onto the chat to me. So one of the sort of the points that are coming up is around the negative stigma and the attack actually on trans and non-binary identities and people in the media. And I think we've seen this as an increasing trend, of course, throughout the course of this year, but also last year as well. And what we are seeing now is obviously the rise of lots of more right-wing politics. So we've obviously had I've forgotten the lady's name now, but the new prime minister in Italy, very right-wing, expressed a number of LGBT sentiments before. There was some research done by Pink News that looked at the historic track record of the current UK government in terms of cabinet, in terms of their LGBT stance. And what came out of that work was this is the most unfriendly LGBT cabinet we've had in decades. We look at the US, there's obviously a huge sort of rift at the moment between Democrats and Republicans around LGBT. And remember, everybody, these are countries that are supposed to be leaders in LGBT equality around the world. So my sort of thought today is that if that's what it's like in the most, liberating countries and cultures for LGBT people, what's it like everywhere else? So I think it's really, really interesting. And Shiraz, your summary of these insights was really useful.
Great, thank you, Matt. Rest of the team, anyone else want to jump in here? Otherwise, I'll keep going. I think, reflecting on this idea of inclusion and is very important. Obviously, now this is the topic of conversation today. One thing I'd just pull out of what Shrey said was around the feeling that you didn't have positive and real allies. That's felt like an aspect of your story that resonated very strongly with me. And I do remember the first time that I was saw a senior leader who was LGBT and thought, oh, I didn't realize I needed a role model like you. So I definitely think it's this combination of inclusive environments plus positive and real allyship, which can be expressed in a myriad of big gestures and small gestures. And just thinking about allies and LGBT leaders, I was struck by this quote that we found from Claudia at IBM, saying inclusivity means not just we are allowed to be there, but that we are valued. I've always said smart teams will do amazing things, but truly diverse teams will do impossible things. So so this interaction between diversity and inclusion. One of the things you hear a lot in diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops and conversations and training is that if you lead with inclusion, diversity will follow. So if you invest your energy in building out inclusive environments, then a natural corollary of that is then more diverse teams, improved diversity of thought, and increased representation of underrepresented communities and people. So just some of the things that we're seeing on kind of the global stage and the importance generally of inclusion. I just wanted to take a step back just for a moment and to reflect on some of the other terms that we see in this space. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with them, but just to kind of outline what we mean. When you hear of diversity and inclusion, sometimes you hear inclusion and diversity, sometimes you hear diversity, equity, and inclusion. I just wanted to run through the difference in those terms. So obviously, inclusion will start at the bottom, where it means centering on building an environment which everyone feels able to thrive no matter their background, identity, or circumstances. And then this then breeds diversity. So this breeds the difference in thoughts, and it's okay to recognize differences. And there are various pillars of diversity that we often think about around gender, around sexuality, around gender identity, as well as biological sex, around socioeconomic diversity, around race and ethnicity. And then the important thing, though, that is everyone is treated the same, regardless of any of those differences. And this is when we bring in the term equality. But giving everyone the same platform doesn't necessarily always take into account extant differences in privilege, structural inequality. And so sometimes you have to then create equal opportunity for people, which may mean spotlighting certain individuals in more, giving people a platform. And one of the aspects of allyship is actually stepping back and providing a space for others to speak. So it's leveraging, in certain instances, your power, privilege, and status to create an environment or opportunity for someone who, in that specific context, has a lower level of power, status, and privilege to speak. Right. So a classic example might be a boardroom environment, which is, heavily skewed towards a certain demographic of people. So inviting someone from an underrepresented community then to speak in that environment is then, to talk about issues that are relevant to them directly with that board, provides an opportunity for a conversation around equity, which is around creating equal opportunities and outcomes for people that take into account those specific differences and the aspect of diversity. Obviously, the baseline has to be equal treatment for everyone, but then in the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, it's about ensuring that we understand the broader context so that we can build an environment in which everyone can succeed equally. So, equality of opportunity is what we're kind of striving for here. But the foundation of all of this is an inclusive environment, one in which people feel like they can be themselves in the first instance. So just a brief note on the difference between diversity, equity, equality, and inclusion. Do let me know in the chat if there are any questions around that, or if you'd like me to talk about anything in a bit more detail. So, this is what we are striving for, right? Matt, did you want to jump in here on anything?
Sorry, yeah, if you don't mind. Yeah,
of course, no, fire away.
Lancaster actually that I sort of read recently, sort of a Harvard Business Review, but there was actually sort of a study done in sort of the US that looked at two different teams. One which were a team of very, very high IQ, and predominantly people who had the same thinking preferences and thinking styles. And then there was then a team which had a below average IQ, but that were actually all wired differently in terms of their thinking styles and preferences. Now, each of the groups were given the same problem to solve. And actually, it was the group that had the lower IQ overall, but the bigger mental toolbox in terms of thinking preferences, in terms of how they approach the question, that actually outperforms the team that had the higher IQ, but obviously a lot of the similar thinkers, which I thought was really interesting. And it shows actually when we do have diverse thinking and diverse backgrounds, and as long as there's cohesion between the different diversities, actually we can really get outperformance. So this is not just a nice thing to do. Of course, it's a great thing for talent and empowering people and underrepresented communities. But of course, this is intrinsically tied to business performance, which is why we are seeing beyond sort of the social sustainability message, a lot of the C-suite now really focusing in on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, because it is an enhancer to performance. So just a couple of things that are there.
No, I completely agree, and one of the, it's been shown in multiple studies. You mentioned the Harvard Business Review, but in others that diversity of thought does breed additional productivity. Breeds a different type of productivity and a different approach to problem solving. And ultimately, this has a positive impact on business performance. And what Shreyas was talking about earlier is this idea of feeling safe and included at work breeds, leads to productivity. And what do we know about productivity is that productivity leads to better deliverables, better output, which has a net, positive impact on the bottom line. So there is a real critical business need for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I think I'm certainly seeing that organizations are understanding, but there's still a range of things that can be done to improve this. Another thing to note as well is around the diversity pillars themselves. And when we're talking about LGBT inclusion kind of specifically today. And so what we're seeing is that there is a lack of maturity in some areas of diversity. And so it's not an equal, there's not a level of equal maturity across the board. Typically what you'll see is when organizations begin a DE&I initiative, a kind of global corporate level, they'll start with gender. It's the easiest in many ways. It's visible in most environments. It's in quite a lot of cases mandated by the regulator that you have to capture some data around gender, obviously depending on your geography and jurisdiction. But gender pay gap reporting, gender board makeup reporting, all of this is becoming much more common now. This has yet to really extend into other pillars of diversity, for example, LGBT. So typically you'll see gender followed by race and ethnicity being the next pillar of diversity that receives dedicated attention as it should, and then LGBT tends to follow after that. Now, the real moment in which an organization levels up from a DE&I perspective is when we stop talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of individual pillars and start to talk about things intersectionally, which is less about the individual identities, underpinning the different diversity pillars, but more about the way in which those aspects of an identity come together and map over each other. For example, if as a white man, sometimes there are there's a lot of privilege and excellent things that relate to kind of my identity, but as a gay man, that's slightly different. So it's the way that those come in. If you're a trans or binary person, then that you have different legacy privileges and things that are afforded or not afforded to you. Then you add race and ethnicity, you add ability, disability into this, you add age, you add socioeconomic background and upbringing, all of the ways in which those environments have impacted your identity, and the different challenges that you face across each aspect of your identity. And then when they come together, that's as soon as you start to talk about that, that's when an organization, I think personally, has reached that second stage in maturity. But anyway, just a few thoughts from my side. Matt, did you want to jump in here on any of that at all?
No, all good. I think I've
okay.
Shared my thoughts on this part.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so just we've got a few minutes left, and I just wanted to end by centering the conversation just on National Inclusion Week specifically, and just to outline a few of our final thoughts on this idea of the power of now. So National Inclusion Week is a global visibility week founded by Inclusive Employers in 2012, and it's had extremely wide reach and has become one of the flagship visibility dates in the calendar to talk about inclusion, to talk about diversity and equity. There's always a theme. I've just popped on the slide here the themes from the last few years. Connect for inclusion, everyday inclusion, each one reach one, united, all slightly different takes on this idea of inclusive environments and inclusive workplaces. Had very large sponsorships, McDonald's and Co-op, you can see for this year and for last year. And this year, the conversation is really centered on this idea of the time to act is not tomorrow, the time to act is not next year, but the time to act is now. And so that's really where the conversation is centered this year. A couple of quotes that stood out for me on just the materials that Inclusive Employers have released. I'll just read them quickly. National Inclusion Week is a great opportunity to put inclusion on the table, even more so than it already is, for discussion and for quotes, sparking thoughts and actions in others. And I think we just wanted to reflect with you on the fact that we've come a long way. Let's take the example of LGBT inclusion, from Stonewall in 1969 through the foundation of the Gay Liberation Front in the UK to UK Black Pride, to global Black Pride and the intersection of queer and Black identities, for example. But there's still a long way to go. How comfortable are we having these conversations at work? How empowered do leaders feel to talk about these on behalf of those communities in, say, a small organization that doesn't have visible representation of a trans or non-binary person, for example? How can we build environments where those voices are still heard, or even if they're not necessarily always there directly? So this idea of building allyship, spaces in which positive allyship and is really forwarded is critical. And the reason that we need to do it now is because the world is changing. As we know, these types of conversations are becoming easier to cover in a working environment. There are a range of organizations like LGBT Great and others that are able to support organizations to tackle these. And fundamentally, one of the things we need is visible role models and visible allies, at the top, at the middle, and at the bottom of an organization. So spotlighting people in your teams that are doing great work is a real critical aspect here. Getting involved right now, not tomorrow, is really key. Events and initiatives, whether that's communications, whether that's visibility programs, whether that's other types of communications, sharing content, all of these things that are done now and regularly can have a definite beneficial impact in the long run. And I think it's very similar to that old adage about trees, right? The best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is right now. So, I think there's definitely this idea that we all need to reflect on as teams and organizations of if we haven't done it already, well, that's okay, but we can do it now. So, one thing I would charge you all with is to, have a conversation with your teams about this, for example. One of the ways, one of the things in the beginning of today in the poll that was raised was around how do we track and monitor inclusion? And this is actually quite a difficult thing to answer. It's very easy, or it's not necessarily easy, but it's much more accessible to track diversity data, particularly if it's submitted. So gender, board makeups from a gender perspective. We're mandated from the regulator to submit that data so we can track it. We have a benchmark. However, how do we track inclusion and how do we monitor it in an organization? There are a couple of things. The first is that you can, see it visibly in the way in which role models are spotlit, the way in which platforms are created for those conversations to be heard, the way in which internal and external communications are leveraged in order to discuss aspects of diversity openly and transparently. However, having a sense of this is great, but exploring this through benchmarking, through third-party assessments can also be very helpful. I know that there's been a push from requests for approvals and those sorts of things for more information around a company's diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, the makeup and the impact of that. LGBT Great offers a 10-point benchmark to track this, and this goes beyond just policies and planning, but extends into training and development, people and talent as well. So when thinking about tracking and monitoring inclusion, we have to be holistic in our perspective of an organization. So we have to understand the internal voices of employees, the externalization of those through different comms channels. We have to ensure that inclusion is reflected not just in the policies that we have, but in the platforms that are given to employees to speak, in the events that they're invited to, and the data that's being collected. So tracking inclusion and tracking diversity are very much interwoven. The key thing is that you start with tracking diversity data, monitoring it, encouraging employees to submit self-ID diversity data, your gender, race, ethnicity, disability data, all of that sort of thing on your HR platforms, I imagine, can encourage you all to do that, because it is important that organizations are empowered to understand what the demographic makeup of their teams are, what the demographic makeup of the organization is, and using that as a jumping off point to then understand whether those people are being included or not, whether there is an inclusive aspect to the environment. And by inclusive aspect, we mean how people feel. So, right, you have to build a framework that's underpinned by data, but then goes beyond that to really understanding how people feel by capturing real feedback, by understanding, how visible role models are spotlit, for example. Matt, is there anything you wanted to add here just around, tracking and monitoring inclusion rather than just diversity?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what we tend to see across the industry, of course, is we talked about it at the beginning, a focus on diversity, the numbers, and organisations are all very busy at the moment trying to figure out, what diversity data can we ask for, depending on what jurisdiction we're operating in. How are we asking employees for that data at what parts of the talent management cycle? I think that there's still a lot more work to do around how we connect the request for that data with the why it's important, through empathy and inclusive leadership. I know we've done quite a lot of work on that. But what we're not sort of seeing as much, I think, is sort of the focus around, really asking and understanding what different groups are actually thinking and feeling, within an organisation, and looking at that data intersectionally. So I think how we got to get more sophisticated, I think, how we do that. But I guess going back to the question, I'm conscious we need to wrap up in 60 seconds. I'm very conscious that we do need to find ways in which we can track and monitor progress. And the IBIT is obviously one of the frameworks that is available sort of out there. But I do believe this is really, really great in focusing stakeholders from all across the business, and really to be effective. Inclusion does need to be like an enterprise-wide initiative, not just that thing that's owned by DE&I or HR or an executive sponsor. So I think how you bring people together is really good. And I know one of the pieces of feedback we've had from members in terms of, why is it we like the IBIT? Because it does enable you to open it out to others, and get their involvement and engagement on this as well. And we all know that actions, bigger thing for today, power of now, do really make a difference. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts from me. I'll pass back over to you just to wrap up. You just need to unmute, Alex.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to share a final few thoughts on what it is that you can do, just a few quick wins, a few acts of authentic allyship. Firstly is consider putting your pronouns in your email signature. We know from talking to our trans and non-binary colleagues that this is something that does actually have a positive impact. If you think about, for example, every time someone's got your name wrong, how did that make you feel? Getting someone's pronouns wrong is very similar, and it signals that you are aware of some of the issues. Now, the issue here is that you can't do that in isolation. So putting your pronouns in your bio, in your email signature is great, but you have to work actively, authentically, to understand why that is important, and to educate yourself on some of the reasons behind that. LGBT Great is here to support, but also doing your own research can be really helpful. Asking someone, if you have people in your network, attending joining an LGBT focused event, or reading content from LGBT focused organizations can be one aspect to do that. If you haven't got DE&I goals across your organization and you're in a position to explore that, whether that's within a team environment or at the organizational level, then definitely start thinking about it. Again, LGBT Great is here to support. And then one thing that's really helpful is to share and engage with LGBT inclusive content on social media. That's internal social media channels that you may have available to you, Yammer, for example, but then probably also LinkedIn and external ones as well. Mentoring and role modeling programs, whether they are internal or external, can be another great vehicle for having these conversations and for demonstrating that authentic allyship. And finally, for one thing you could explore is having a conversation with your teams around inclusive language. Do we say hi folks? Do we say hi guys? What do we say? If you're in the US, do you say y'all? I can't know y'all. Never feels natural. But some of those pieces of terminology, the short things that really demonstrate that you're thinking. Instead of saying wife or husband, say partner. Some of these types of conversations, creating an explicit space to have that conversation within your team environment, can be a great starting point to then building on when having a conversation around LGBT plus inclusion and broader intersectional inclusion as well. So the key message from today is really, there are things you can be doing now, and we encourage you to do them. So thank you. Matt, I'll hand back to you if there's anything final you wanted to cover.
Yeah, just to say thank you to everyone for sort of dialing in, and hope you found this conversation interesting. A bit of a snapshot really on National Inclusion Week, LGBT trends, and looking at sort of organisational frameworks and sort of best practices. We have got another event that's happening next week in partnership with City. This is actually a face-to-face event that's in London for Lesbian Visibility Day. That's on Wednesday, the 5th. Of October, so there will be an invite coming round about that. And any questions that you've got, you can get in touch with us at info@lgbtgreat.com. So that's info@lgbtgreat.com. And thanks to everyone for dialing in. Thank you.
Thank you. I just echo that, and then wishing everyone a great rest of the week.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.